The road is empty. Not just quiet, but empty, the way a road gets at midnight when you start to wonder if you're the only thing moving in the world. He's driving a 1974 Kensworth with 80,000 pounds, 36,000 kilograms of ketchup and mustard behind him. U.S. Route 17 unrolling through the Virginia dark. He knows every curve of Paris Mountain. He knows where the CB signal gets thin and where it comes back. It gets thin right around now. And then something in the dark up ahead stops being dark. A light. White. Thick. Physical in a way that light shouldn't be. It fills the cab. It fills everything. And Harry Joe Turner reaches for his gun. This is still unexplained. Brief explorations of unsolved mysteries. My name is Mark. Virginia's Shenandoah Valley in 1979 is a particular kind of American place. Long stretches of two-lane highway through rolling farmland and dense forest. Small towns spaced far enough apart that the dark between them is real dark. Route 17 cuts through the Blue Ridge foothills, winding through the terrain that hasn't changed much in 100 years. At night, the trees come right up to the shoulders, and your headlights feel like the only light in the world. It's the kind of road where you know you're alone because there's no sign of anyone else. And you know it in your body before your brain catches up. Harry Joe Turner was 28 years old that August. He'd come up hard and capable. Ex-Navy, trained as a sharpshooter, 24 wins as an amateur boxer. He was the kind of man who'd spent his life building the specific confidence that comes from knowing how to handle himself in a physical situation. He wasn't jumpy. He wasn't the type to see things that weren't there. He had a wife at home and a job that rewarded competence and asked nothing else of him. He was a working trucker on a routine haul. The assignment was straightforward. Winchester to Fredericksburg, 80 miles, 130 kilometers of Virginia highway in the middle of the night, carrying condiments. He left a Winchester gas station at 10:52 p.m. on August 28, 1979. The night was quiet. He noted the road felt strangely deserted. Like another world was his actual phrase. But that was the only thing that seemed off. He was crossing Paris Mountain on Route 17 when his CB radio cut out with a screeching burst of interference. That was the last ordinary moment of his life. What happened next? Turner described as a beam of white light. Palpably thick was the word he kept coming back to. Not a beam you see, but a beam you feel. It engulfed the cab, and Turner had the sensation that his 80,000-pound rig was being pulled upward. Vacuumed was the word he used, like the truck's weight meant nothing. Then someone opened his door. A humanoid figure appeared at the cab door. Another was on the roof. One of them gripped his shoulder with what Turner called a grip like steel, and the pain was immediate and real. He was a trained marksman. He did what training and instinct told him to do. He drew his .32 caliber revolver, pressed it against the figure, and fired. All 8 rounds. Hollow points. Point blank. Nothing happened. The bullet passed through. Turner's own words, "My God, I can't kill this thing." After that, he doesn't have a clear memory of the road. What he does have instead is something that sounds less like a dream and more like a place. He recalled being taken somewhere, a city-like environment that looked devastated, like something had already happened to it that couldn't be undone. He described his captors as humanoid, dressed in white surgical clothing and caps. When the caps came off, he saw numbers written directly on their foreheads. They communicated in a language he called Alpha Lazulu, which at first sounded like a recording played in reverse. But when they slowed it down, he understood them. They told him they came from a city 2.3 light years beyond Alpha Centauri, a star system roughly 6.5 to 6.8 light years from Earth. They told him what happened to their world, what happened to ours. Then he was back. He woke in the warehouse parking lot in Fredericksburg. His watch said 11:17 p.m. The warehouse clock said 3 a.m. He had roughly 4 hours that simply weren't there. His odometer showed 17 miles, 27 kilometers traveled, the exact distance to the point of the encounter on Paris Mountain. But the fuel tanks told a different story. He'd burned 114 gallons, 431 liters of diesel. That's enough fuel to make the full 160-mile, 257-kilometer round trip more than 3 times over. The math on that doesn't work for 17 miles. It doesn't work for anything that stayed on this road. His CB antennas were damaged. One had been burned. One appeared to have been cut off clean. And his right shoulder hurt where the grip had landed. Over the following days and weeks, Turner's body started doing things that had no medical explanation. His right arm developed what he described as localized super strength, an ability to move or throw objects far beyond what he should have been capable of. He had a ruptured blood vessel in his chest. His hearing was wrong, a persistent ringing that wouldn't quit. He developed sudden cravings for food that he'd previously disliked, specifically coconut and deer meat. I generally don't know what to do with that detail, but I'm not leaving it out. He said he could read at extraordinary speed. He claimed that he could see through things, including, in the most unsettling version of this, his wife sleeping beside him, describing what he saw as her skeleton and internal organs. On September 3rd, less than 2 weeks after the encounter, Turner led Virginia police on a chase at 110 miles per hour, 177 kilometers per hour. He told investigators afterward that an invisible alien had been in the passenger seat, urging him on. That's when the world around him started treating him the way the world treats people who say things like that. He was examined by investigators from MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network. Fred Whitting filed a detailed field report. APRO, the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, covered the case in their bulletin and framed it carefully. The question wasn't whether something had happened to Turner, but what kind of something. Turner also mentioned that at some point during the encounter, something had been placed inside his shoulder. That detail would resurface years later in broader investigations into what researchers were beginning to call alien implants. And then the public record on Harry Joe Turner gets very quiet. A Richmond, Virginia Times-Dispatch reporter spent 3 hours with him in September 1979, just weeks after the encounter. And what he found was a man sitting at home, chain-smoking, taking pills to calm his nerves, turning the experience over and over in his mind, and finding no bottom to it. Turner told him, quote, 20 years from now, I'll still probably never know what happened, unquote. Investigators documented crying spells that came without warning, suicidal thoughts that he didn't hide from the people asking questions, a growing isolation from the life that he'd had before, the ruptured blood vessel in his chest that medicine couldn't fully account for. A man who had been, by every account, steady and self-possessed, coming apart in ways that no one around him had the framework to address or even name. He was not the same man who had left the gas station. People have been trying to account for what happened to Harry Turner for more than 4 decades, and the honest answer is that nobody has fully pulled it off. But the attempts are worth sitting with, because each one illuminates a different corner of the problem. The medical explanation goes like this. Turner may have experienced a severe dissociative episode, triggered by fatigue, a neurological event, or some combination of the two. Long-haul trucking in 1979 meant irregular sleep, poor nutrition on the road, and long stretches of monotonous dark highway. Conditions that are generally known to produce altered states. Highway hypnosis is real and documented. Some researchers proposed that the encounter was an extraordinary vivid hallucination, and that the physical and psychological collapse that followed was the aftermath of a genuine mental health crisis, rather than a physical one. That's a reasonable read, up to the point where it isn't. The fuel is the wall. You can explain a hallucination. You cannot hallucinate 114 gallons of consumed diesel. You cannot hallucinate burned and severed antennas. Every researcher who tried to fit Turner's case inside a purely psychological framework eventually ran into those numbers and had to stop. The version most UFO investigators landed on is the classical abduction model. Turner was physically taken. His truck was either held in place or transported. His odometer recording only the 17 miles to the encounter point, while his engine ran for hours under conditions that burned fuel at a rate consistent with several hundred miles of travel. The 4 hours of missing time represent an actual journey. The physiological changes, the implant in his shoulder, the altered sensory perception, these fit a pattern that researchers like Bud Hopkins were beginning to document systematically in the late 70s. Turner's case carried specific weight in those circles because of the corroborating physical evidence. A man can misremember a dream, but he can't misremember an empty fuel tank. Now here's the angle I keep returning to, and it's the one that serious researchers came back to quietly even when they weren't sure what to do with it. Turner's captors didn't just take him. They told him things, specific things. They identified where they came from. They named a location 2.3 light years beyond Alpha Centauri. They described a civilization that had been destroyed. They issued a warning about what was coming for us. That is not the behavior of beings running a biological survey. That's the behavior of beings with something to communicate, and a reason to communicate it. Some investigators began arguing that certain high strangeness cases, Turner's among them, represented deliberate contact attempts rather than random interceptions. Intelligence trying to break through in a form a human being could retain and report. Turner couldn't have fabricated the specific astronomy. Alpha Centauri is 4.37 light years from Earth. He placed his captor's origin 2.3 light years beyond that. That's a coordinate, and that's a claim you can check against a star map. The implant research pushes that further. Fred Whitting's field report flagged the shoulder detail early, and later investigators looking at what some researchers called silicon-based biological constructs found that the objects recovered from reported abductees weren't simple tracking devices. Dr. Roger Lear, who spent years surgically removing anomalous objects from experiencers, found that many showed isotope ratios consistent with meteoric iron, compositions not produced by any known terrestrial manufacturing process. The theory that gained real traction among people who weren't easily impressed was that these objects were sophisticated biological interfaces, not tags, something closer to receivers. That Turner's post-encounter changes weren't random side effects. They were the system working as designed. And then there's the framework that researcher Paul Benowitz was developing before his own story got complicated, which is that the abduction program wasn't opportunistic. It was methodical. The beings Turner encountered weren't explorers stumbling across a lone truck on a Virginia highway. They were operators running a procedure, surgical clothing, identification numbers on their foreheads, a communication delivered in structured, translatable language, a device placed with apparent intention. Benowitz wrote that whatever installed these things could pull the switch at any time, that control ran deeper than the encounter itself, and didn't end when Turner woke up in a parking lot. That's the one I can't set down, not because I'm convinced it's true, but because Turner described beings who had numbered themselves. Workers in a system number themselves. Visitors don't. That detail is so specific and so strange, and so far outside anything a frightened man would think to invent, that I keep coming back to it every time I think I'm done with this case. By the time reporters and investigators stopped checking in on Harry Joe Turner, what they found was a man the encounter had hollowed out. The crying spells, the isolation, the pills he took just to get through a day. the suicidal thoughts he didn't bother to hide, a ruptured blood vessel in his chest that medicine noted and then couldn't trace back to anything. He sat at home and smoked and turned it over in his mind and found no bottom to it. The boxer who had won 24 fights, the Navy sharpshooter who knew how to handle himself, he had pressed a loaded gun against something on a Paris mountain and pulled the trigger 8 times, and none of it had mattered, and he never quite recovered from finding that out. What happened to him in the years that followed isn't documented in any record I found. He simply recedes from the public account, the way people do when the world loses interest and moves on. But the road is still there. Route 17, Paris Mountain, the Blue Ridge Dark, still empty at midnight, still the kind of place where your headlights feel like the only light left, and the trees come right up to the edge, and there's nothing between you and whatever is out there except the speed you're moving at. Still the kind of road where a man once reached for his gun and found out it wasn't enough. I don't know about you, but this one was hard to shake. Still Unexplained is created and hosted by me, Mark Evanoff, and you can find the show and episode previews at www.stillunexplained.com, and follow us on Instagram at StillUnexplainedPod for brief video previews, often featuring actual images and visuals from the case. Please follow wherever you listen, leave a rating or review, and share it with someone who'd appreciate it. I'll see you next time. Thanks for listening.